The flight was supposed to be routine, just another long haul for the busy black CEO who was used to running the boardroom with authority. But as soon as he stepped onto the plane, he felt a subtle shift in power, one that came not from the staff or fellow passengers, but from the pilot herself. Calm, composed, and with a presence that demanded respect. She didn't just follow the rules, she owned the cockpit, and quietly, she forced him to the back. A move that left him stunned and uncomfortable. He was a man used to control, used to making decisions that affected thousands. Yet in that moment, every ounce of his confidence was challenged. The passengers noticed it too, a silent tension rippling through the cabin. As two worlds collided, the CEO's authority versus the pilot's unwavering command. As the plane soared above the clouds, the atmosphere crackled with unspoken challenges. How could someone in her seat, someone he underestimated, hold the power to change everything he had built? And more importantly, what he didn't know was that this encounter was only the beginning. One misjudgment, one underestimated skill, and everything he worked for could unravel in ways he never imagined. By the time the plane touched down, lives were about to change forever, but the CEO had no idea how close he was to losing not just control over this flight, but control over his entire career. What happened next would shock everyone and leave the corporate world talking. The story that started in a cockpit was about to become far bigger than anyone expected. The CEO sank into his seat, trying to mask his frustration, but his mind was racing. He had built his empire from the ground up, faced boardroom battles, and outmaneuvered rivals. Yet here, on a plane, someone he barely knew had stripped him of control with nothing more than quiet authority and sharp precision. He glanced toward the cockpit door, curious and wary. The pilot's calm demeanor wasn't just confidence, it was experience honed to perfection. A skill that silently commanded obedience from everyone around her. Little did he know, this pilot wasn't just any professional. Years of training, missions in high-pressure environments, and a reputation for making decisions that saved lives had forged her into someone who didn't just follow the rules. She rewrote them when necessary. Passengers whispered quietly, sensing the unusual dynamic, while the CEO wrestled with his own ego. How had he, a man accustomed to being the center of attention, ended up sidelined on his own flight? Memories of his rise to power flickered in his mind, boardroom victories, high-stakes negotiations, and the respect he commanded everywhere he went. Yet each recollection now seemed fragile, almost irrelevant, compared to the quiet command radiating from the cockpit. Something about this woman unsettled him in ways he couldn't articulate. There was a subtle intelligence in her every move, a precision in her voice and gestures that hinted at secrets he didn't yet understand. As the flight continued, the tension grew thicker. Unspoken questions lingered. Who exactly was she? How far would she go? And what was about to happen the moment they landed? Whatever it was, it promised to change everything, and the CEO could feel, deep in his gut, that he was about to face a reckoning unlike anything in his carefully controlled life. The CEO couldn't focus on anything, except the pilot. Every time he tried to regain his composure, she moved with effortless authority, checking instruments, speaking to the co-pilot, and occasionally glancing at him with a quiet, knowing look that made his confidence falter. He wasn't used to being questioned, even silently, yet every decision she made seemed flawless, every command precise. He felt a knot of unease growing inside him, an unfamiliar vulnerability that he hated admitting, even to himself. Around him, the cabin hummed with subtle whispers. Other passengers had begun noticing the unusual tension between the CEO and the pilot. A few seasoned travelers exchanged glances, sensing that this was no ordinary flight. Meanwhile, the flight attendants moved efficiently, following the pilot's lead, their calm demeanor only amplifying the CEO's growing discomfort. He was no longer the center of attention. Instead, he was watching, learning, and increasingly realizing that his usual strategies of influence wouldn't work here. Meanwhile, the pilot seemed completely unfazed. Her mind was clearly on more than just flying the plane. There were reports she'd received, data she'd analyzed in the background, decisions she'd made behind the scenes that the CEO couldn't see yet. Something in the way she carried herself hinted at a past filled with challenges far greater than any boardroom dispute. Perhaps she had faced threats or crises that demanded courage and clarity, under pressure skills that the CEO had never truly had to rely on. In his cushioned corporate world, as the flight stretched on, the CEO began to feel a creeping dread. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and with it, his entire world felt less certain. Questions gnawed at him. How much did she know? How far was she willing to go? And most importantly, when the plane landed, what would be waiting for him that could change everything he thought he controlled? The answers were coming in. He wasn't ready for them. The plane descended through a thick layer of clouds, and with each passing minute, the CEO's anxiety grew. He could feel the weight of the flight pressing down on him, not just physically, but mentally. Every glance from the pilot felt like a challenge, a reminder that control was no longer his to claim. The hum of the engines became a backdrop to the tension tightening in his chest, each moment drawing him closer to an inevitable confrontation he couldn't yet fully grasp. He tried to speak, to assert himself, but his words faltered. The pilot's .com/steady eyes met his, and in them, he saw no hesitation, only focus. It was unsettling, almost unnerving, because it reminded him that she wasn't just in charge of the plane. She seemed in command of him too. Every decision he had ever made with authority suddenly felt small, irrelevant in the face of someone who acted with clarity and courage he had rarely encountered. Passengers were oblivious to most of the silent battle unfolding, but a few noticed the subtle shifts: the CEO's stiff posture, the pilot's measured movements, the way her voice carried quiet authority that left no room for argument. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this encounter wasn't just about the flight. It was about power, respect, and reputation, and he sensed, with a cold certainty, that the consequences of underestimating her could ripple far beyond the cabin walls. As the landing gear lowered, the tension became almost unbearable. Every second stretched like an eternity. The CEO clenched his hands, trying to anticipate what would happen next. Yet he couldn't see the full picture. The pilot's next move would change everything, and he had no idea whether he was ready for it. The storm of events he had unknowingly stepped into was about to reach its breaking point, and the truth, shocking, irreversible, and career-defining, was waiting just beyond the cockpit door. Just as the plane touched down smoothly, a new layer of tension sliced through the cabin. The CEO exhaled sharply, thinking the immediate challenge was over, only to notice something on the pilot's console that made his pulse spike. A flashing alert, a code he didn't recognize. Something that suggested the flight had triggered an unexpected protocol, one that no passenger, no boardroom strategy, and certainly no CEO had ever had to face. His carefully controlled world was spiraling further out of his grasp. The pilot's eyes flicked to the alert, but her expression remained unreadable. She didn't panic. She didn't flinch. Instead, she made a rapid series of decisions, issuing instructions that were precise yet incomprehensible to anyone not trained to understand them. The CEO realized, in that instant, that this wasn't just about authority in a physical space. This was about knowledge, experience, and the ability to act under pressure in ways he could never imagine. Every ounce of his ego rebelled against the fact that he had no role in this unfolding scenario. Meanwhile, subtle murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Some noticed the tense energy in the cabin, others glanced nervously at the cockpit door. Unseen to them, the pilot was already working to manage a crisis he couldn't even comprehend, and the CEO felt a creeping fear. What if this wasn't just a minor protocol? What if this single flight could expose vulnerabilities that would ripple far beyond the plane, threatening his career and reputation in ways he couldn't anticipate? As the engines powered down and the cabin lights dimmed slightly, the CEO realized the real conflict wasn't over authority. It was over survival, perception, and who truly held the power. And somewhere in the cockpit, the pilot knew exactly how far she could push him before everything he had built could come crashing down. The moment the plane came to a complete stop, the cabin held its breath. The CEO's heart pounded as he finally saw the pilot step out of the cockpit, calm and composed, yet carrying an aura of authority that made everyone else feel the weight of her presence. He followed, hesitating, unsure whether to confront her or beg for explanations. In front of the gathered passengers and crew, she spoke clearly, her voice carrying over the still humming engines. This flight encountered a critical safety protocol that required immediate intervention. The situation was beyond standard procedure, and my actions prevented a major disaster. Murmurs ran through the cabin. The CEO's mind raced. Every boardroom tactic he had ever mastered suddenly felt insignificant in the face of her expertise. He realized that in trying to assert authority on this flight, he had underestimated her completely, and it could have cost more than just pride. But just as he tried to compose himself, the unexpected twist hit. The pilot turned to him with a subtle, almost sly smile. "And by the way," she added, "your company's data breach earlier this year, I traced it. The way you handled it could have destroyed your clients. Consider this a lesson. Authority without accountability can't save you." The CEO's face drained of color. In one flight, one encounter, he had been challenged, humbled, and exposed not just professionally, but personally. As the passengers disembarked, whispering among themselves about the tension and the drama, the CEO remained frozen. Finally understanding that leadership wasn't just about power or titles, the pilot had done more than endanger or elevate a moment of pride. She had reminded him that true respect and authority must be earned through action, integrity, and skill. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath, he knew one thing: nothing would ever feel the same again. The CEO stood on the tarmac, watching the passengers disappear into the terminal, still trying to process everything that had just happened. He had come on this flight expecting to assert control, to command respect, and instead, he had been confronted with a truth he couldn't ignore. The pilot had shown him that real authority wasn't about titles or power. It was about skill, integrity, and the courage to act when it mattered most. Over the following days, the CEO reflected on the pilot's words and actions. He reviewed the decisions he had made in his company, realizing where arrogance had blinded him and where accountability had been overlooked. Employees who had quietly questioned his leadership suddenly made sense, and he understood that respect was something earned, not assumed. The encounter on that flight had exposed not only his vulnerabilities but also the areas where he could grow, and he knew he couldn't ignore the lessons.